participating virtually, that they are visible at all times, both to each other and to us in the Boothroyd room. If members are attending virtually and they have any technical problems, they should email the Westminster Hall clerks. Email address, which is westminsterhallclerks@parliament.uk. Members attending physically should clean their spaces before they use them and as they leave the room. I'd also like to remind members that Mr. Speaker has stated that masks should be worn unless you are speaking. Members attending physically who are in the latter stages of a call list should use the seats in the public gallery and move on to the horseshoe when seats become available, and members can only speak from the horseshoe where there are microphones. Order, order. Tom Randall to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered human rights in Hong Kong. Ms. Gorney, it's a pleasure to serve your chairmanship this afternoon. This is the first Westminster Hall debate that I have initiated. It is a privilege to speak, and I'm grateful that this debate has been selected. But I hope that honourable and right honourable members will understand when I say that I wish I was not here. I wish none of us were here today to discuss this matter, and this debate was entirely avoidable had international obligations been met. Let me say from the outset what this debate is not about. It is not about colonialism or interference by former colonial power. In his final acts as Governor of Hong Kong, Chris Passon telegrammed London to announce, "I have relinquished the administration of this government." 156 years of British rule over Hong Kong ended on the 1st of July 1997, and we're not here to debate taking it back. But Hong Kong was handed over to China following an agreement that took the form of an international treaty lodged at the United Nations, which both the United Kingdom and the People's Republic of China entered into freely. It is right that we consider whether that agreement, the Sino-British Joint Declaration on the question of Hong Kong, is being upheld, and whether or not that meets both our and Hong Kongers' legitimate expectations. The Joint Declaration was signed in December 1984. The text sets out the basis on which Hong Kong will be returned to China. It states that the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will be vested with executive, legislative and independent judicial power, including that of final adjudication. The laws currently in force in Hong Kong will remain basically unchanged. It goes on to say that the current social and economic systems in Hong Kong will remain unchanged, and so will the lifestyle. Rights and freedoms, including those of the person, of speech, of the press, of assembly, of association, of travel, of movement, of correspondence, of strike, of choice of occupation, of academic research and of religious belief will be ensured by law in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. I submit to you, Chair, that all of those rights and freedoms have been diminished in modern-day Hong Kong. Last year, China passed a national security law for Hong Kong that created a number of chilling measures. A new security office with its own personnel has been established by China in Hong Kong outside of local jurisdiction. Some criminal cases can now be tried in mainland China. Hong Kong's chief executive has the power to appoint judges to hear national security cases. The law includes many broad brush offences, including provoking by unlawful means hatred among Hong Kong residents towards the Central People's Government or the government of the region, which is likely to cause serious consequences. Given the extraterritorial nature of the legislation, it might well apply to those of us participating in the debate this afternoon. But this debate isn't about history or rules or what might happen to members of Parliament. It's about people like Donna Kong, who has lived in Hong Kong her whole life, but has decided to take the difficult decision to leave her family behind and moved with her husband to Liverpool, saying, "Nowadays we have to be careful what we say in the streets." Her husband adding, "Hong Kong is going from a free international city to just another Chinese city." It's about people like Jimmy Lai, jailed in April 2021 for his participation in a peaceful protest in 2019, but likely in reality because he has the temerity to publish a newspaper that criticises the government. Or Martin Lee, a barrister and member of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong for over 20 years, regarded and revered as the father of democracy in Hong Kong, who has been silenced by the national security law, stopping his public activism and no longer granting media interviews. He has also been sentenced for participating in an unlawful assembly, although his sentence was suspended. The crackdown on human rights in Hong Kong has been all-pervasive, and if I might just give some examples, the legislature has passed an immigration bill to restrict freedom of movement in and out of Hong Kong. The Chief of Police has floated the idea of a law to target so-called fake news and called for the closure of Jimmy Lai's Apple Daily, the last pro-democracy publication. Police have censored a website belonging to a Taiwanese church. The government has attacked the Hong Kong Bar Association and fired 129 civil servants for refusing to sign an oath of allegiance. And the local broadcaster RTHK has purged its online platform of any shows over a year old, but given Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, her own television show, presenting 4 times a day, every day of the week. And so-called national security education is to be embedded across the curriculum in all secondary schools. The examples I've given here are from April 2021 alone. That is just 1 month in the life of Hong Kongers. So I welcome the steps taken by the government in response to China's actions. The government has suspended the UK's extradition treaty with Hong Kong and extended the embargo on certain military items already imposed on mainland China to Hong Kong as well. And in particular, I welcome the new visa route to people from Hong Kong who have British national overseas status and their close family members. This is a generous offer that I suggest befits a global Britain that takes this issue seriously, and I'm pleased that the Home Office has announced that it's received 34,000 applications for visas in the first 2 months of operation. The government recognises that there is an ongoing breach of China's obligations, and I do ask whether further measures might be taken. Is there scope to work with allies and partners to ensure a coordinated approach? For example, I read recently that Germany will not accept BNO passports as identity documents, and it is important, I think, that democracies take a common line on matters such as this. We continue to have British judges sitting on Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal, a position that perhaps looks increasingly untenable as the current situation continues. And as we are able to identify officials within Hong Kong guilty of human rights breaches, I also ask whether it might be time to consider whether targeted sanctions against them should be considered, or at least their effectiveness assessed. I know that previously the Minister has kindly indicated he'd be willing to meet me and fellow members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong to discuss this subject, and I'd be very willing to take him up on that offer. There is no dispute resolution clause in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but it is a living document, and the United Kingdom is party to it. This country has a duty to protect the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers, and until such time as those freedoms are restored, I expect from the voices from this island will only get louder, and I look forward to hearing some of those voices this afternoon.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered human rights in Hong Kong. We now go to Oak Hill and South Perthshire to John Nicholson.
Thank you very much. What we are seeing in Hong Kong is a two-pronged assault on truth. Firstly, China attacks the source of truth, reporting by threatening and expelling journalists who expose the extent of China's authoritarian behavior. Secondly, China creates an Orwellian alternative narrative in which those who tell the truth are the liars and those who commit violent acts of repression are the liberators. China's leaders hate journalism. At the end of March, the BBC's China correspondent was driven out of Hong Kong. Plainclothes goons followed him and his family to the airport. Nor was this an isolated case. Most independent foreign correspondents have now been expelled as Beijing proceeds to eliminate the last vestiges of Hong Kong's freedom. With this in mind, it's hardly surprising to see China ranked as one of the worst countries in the world for media freedoms by the World Press Freedom Index. It's a dismal 177th. Once upon a time, some thought that Hong Kong could be a beacon for China, spreading its values to the mainland. Instead, the opposite has happened. Under its current leader, China has become ever more controlling and hostile to the truth. Hong Kong is merely the latest victim of a malign system which has trampled on press freedoms, democracy, cultural and religious minorities, and once independent nations. As the downtrodden and oppressed people of Tibet, the Uyghurs, and many others can testify. Journalistic censorship is paired with other despotic trademarks, disinformation being the foremost. In the digital world in which we live, it's not enough for the Chinese leadership to stem information coming from legitimate news outlets. Information from normal citizens must also be quashed. China employs what is sometimes called the 50-cent army, so-called because of their meager daily pay. Thought to number millions, these Communist Party drones track online activity and work to sway public opinion with disinformation both inside China and out with. Bots counter unfavorable reports and conversations about the Chinese regime. It's a tactic deployed by the Kremlin too, and is spreading across the globe. During the recent onslaught against Gaza by the Israelis, there were mounting reports of another onslaught, the mass reporting by pro-Israeli groups of Palestinian posts from Gaza. This is a new world in which social media is weaponized by the powerful. So what can we do faced with this bleak descent into untruth? We must champion journalism. We must speak up when we are told that there are alternative facts. We must steel the resolve of social media companies when they crumble under the weight of totalitarian pressure and their own avarice. We must speak the names of those bullied, arrested, and imprisoned. We must honor the memory of those brave young people crushed by the Chinese regime in Tiananmen Square. We must assert the rights of the Uyghurs and call out their detention and torture. We must champion the right of Tibet to self-determination. And we must never accept Hong Kong's slide into the grim, oppressive reality faced by so many in mainland China, because we promised them better. Thank you.
I now turn to Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Ms. Guy, it's a pleasure as ever to serve under your stewardship, and I commend my honourable friend for achieving this debate. This is indeed the issue of the moment. It hasn't gone away, it won't go away, and I believe it is timely because the G7 starts its meeting tomorrow. And frankly, in my view, if this is not the major conclusion of the G7 that China has become the greatest threat to liberal democracy here and around the world, then I think the G7 tomorrow will have failed. It's as simple as that. Today we are talking about Hong Kong, but we could just as easily be talking about the suppression, nay the genocide of the Uyghurs, or the suppression, nay the genocide of Tibetans, or the increasing pressure on the Inner Mongolians, or on the Falun Gong, or on the Christians. This is a regime which is both intolerant, dictatorial, and brutal. It accepts no difference from its dictated opinions and views, and any attempt to question is treated with brutality and incarceration without serious or possible free trials. And my honourable friend's quite right to have made the point that this also is a regime that has now trashed a particular international agreement. It has broken what it said it would agree to over the rights and privileges and freedoms in Hong Kong under the one state, two systems. But I suspect the real reason for that is the only reason for signing the original Sino-British agreement was that the Chinese Communist Party believed it would act as a magnet for the reintroduction of Taiwan under the umbrella completely of the state authority of the Communist Party of China. The problem is that the government in Taiwan, elected now, rejects that future. And on that basis, they can see no reason why they should continue with this troublesome area in Hong Kong where people have been campaigning, we would say legitimately and freely, for the right to express their views for a free press and for democracy. That, for the Chinese government, is no longer necessary, and their suppression that has followed has both been swift, but in a way somewhat predictable, without the reason for Hong Kong to to exist in this separate state. Therefore, it must now be crushed. And it's quite interesting to see what they've done in the last month. Fired civil servants, arrested the leaders of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement, introduced national security education for children as young as 6, amended Hong Kong's electoral system to bar pro-democracy parties from running, and passed an immigration law that would allow officials to restrict freedom of movement in and out of the city. Arrests, prosecutions, and jail sentences behind closed doors. And I do question why British judges are still earning a living in Hong Kong. It is not possible for them to argue, I believe, anymore that they are modifying or ameliorating this. I do think now that the Bar Council here should speak to those who are earning a living in Hong Kong and say it's time to draw stumps and come home. All they are doing is giving, in a sense, a bit of succor to a brutal regime, intolerant and debased. And so I call on them to do that. But these arrests and prosecutions are staggering. 10,000 people have been arrested, 2,300 charged since the anti-extradition protest started in 2019. 10 years to life imprisonment is the norm now for these, and of course subversion, succession, collusion with foreign political forces, and terrorism are the new laws. I don't know why they bothered with the others. They could have just stuck down terrorism because they're going to find them guilty anyway, so they might as well make it simple. But they've gone through this prolonged process. No doubt they think somehow it persuades people. But I am worried about the way that this is going. When you look at what's happening to the children, as young as 6, taught to memorize the 4 crimes under national security law, and I've just mentioned those. Schools to inform police and parents about incidents involving political propaganda, and Hong Kong universities have now fired pro-democracy academics and cut ties with their student unions following direction from Beijing. The real point about this is, what can we do? Well, we've already done a lot, as my honourable friend mentioned it, so I won't repeat it, but the BNO passports is the key, although the Chinese are now threatening not to recognise those BNO passports and nor to allow them to leave the country should they be showing these. And I'm not astonished, but I am saddened by Germany's response. I don't know whether Germany one day will wake up to the idea that no matter how much you appease them, it never works. That idea that they need China and don't want to upset them because of their own requirements of dependency on manufacture is one of the grave errors that history teaches us. You start down that road and your dependency leads you further and further. So I hope they will review that. Number 1, I want more Magnitsky sanctions on Hong Kong and Chinese officials, and I would extend those, of course, further to those involved in the dreadful Uyghur massacres. Offering assistance to Hong Kong, was born in 1997. The BNO visa scheme currently does not cover these Hong Kongers born after 1997, including many young Hong Kong students vulnerable now to arrest. I say to my honourable friend from the Foreign Office, I think ministers should work with like-minded partners to ensure there are lifeboat schemes for these young Hong Kongers. Ministers should ensure that Hong Kong is on the agenda at the G7, and I started with this, and it's vital, and I want to come back to it at the end. And I want the government to review the rules around UK investment in companies complicit in human rights abuse and be much more explicit about the supply chains so that every single business or investor in the UK or abroad knows what the links are to the main companies all the way down the chain. This has not happened, and it must happen. And I want to conclude, therefore, Ms. Ghani, on this. I believe this is the single biggest threat facing liberal democracy that now exists. We have been complacent, we have run to China to do business, and we have therefore turned a blind eye for too long across the Western world to the abuses taking place. The lessons of the 1930s tell us, if you assume that what governments say is not what they mean, then you are destined to be trapped in the reality of what they do. That is where we are now. And in the G7, tomorrow and from onwards till the end of it, I would like my government to insist that by the end of the G7, we make a clear, unequivocal, united statement that we will no longer put up with the abuses and the nature of the Chinese government in their attacks on their neighbours and on their own people who live in China. If we do that, then just maybe we will have started the beginning of the change that will secure and rescue our own democracies and our own people's freedoms.
I now turn to Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Ms. Gani. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship of these proceedings today. Can I congratulate the member for Gedling for bringing this very important and vital matter before the House today, and it's always an honour to speak after the member from Chingford, who's made an excellent speech. If ever as a country and as a people we should be thankful of our freedoms of worship, to think openly, of freedoms generally, it must be today when we consider the weight of the matter in front of us. Now, I speak, Madam Chair, as a member of the All-Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong, and I want to focus my comments specifically on Section 38 of the National Security Law. If we look at that law in its full effect, it makes this meeting of Parliament and every single one of us who are here today and those who are watching these proceedings guilty of breaching that national security law. Under Section 38, its global extraterrestrial jurisdiction remit, those measures means that each of us could stand accused of collusion, sedition, terrorism, subversion against China with a foreign country. Just think of it. China is reaching into this country and effectively passed a law that says that what we dare to talk about today is unlawful and that we could be held accountable for it if we ever walked in or got over to Hong Kong or China. Anyone who's lobbied us about this matter would too be guilty under that law. Even friends of Beijing, and there may be some MPs who are attending this debate or watching this debate who are openly or secretly friends of Beijing, they are vulnerable too because they have actually spoken about or participated or associated themselves with the seditious practice that Article 38 of that law brings about. So as an officer of the Hong Kong APPG, I certainly wouldn't expect to get to Hong Kong anytime soon, and neither indeed should any member attending this debate. So this is a human rights issue that not only affects Hong Kongers, but affects anyone who dares to speak out or address some of the seditious issues that are ongoing. It is a breach of freedom. It's a breach of freedom of religion. We've already heard from my colleague from the SNP. It's a breach of freedom of expression by journalists. It's a clamp down on the right to worship, whether you're of the Protestant denominations, of Catholicism, of Judaism, of Hinduism, of any other religious practice. Today, that freedom of worship is now officially to be oppressed. It saddens me. I cannot mention in public, or indeed in public prayer, or in any of my speeches, my friends in the various mission groups that I know of and have worked with in the past in Hong Kong. Hong Kongers who wish to profess the name of their saviour can only do so under fear. Madam Chair, we have a duty to speak out as parliamentarians. Our government, world governments, and I agree with the member from Gedling on this point in particular under the G7, have signed up to Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is a right to freedom of religious belief and expression and a freedom to worship. If my Hong Kong friend and pastor, whom I know very well, were to come here, I will not name him because I think it's unfair to name him because of the effect it could have on his family. If he were to come here and preach in one of our local churches in Northern Ireland, or even in his own church in Hong Kong, he does so under the fear of breaking this national security law. That law can only be interpreted by Beijing. This is persecution. This is torture. And it is via the long arm of the state. The bamboo curtain, Madam Chair, on freedom and toleration is falling and falling fast. And our nation must speak out about religious freedoms, freedoms for journalists, freedoms for business to practice in the way that they wish to practice without being tortured or under the suspicion of being tortured or fear of being tortured in the future. Now, the UK potentially faces a tsunami of millions of Hong Kongers coming to Europe. I welcome the decision to grant the Hong Kong British National Overseas Visa. I must say, I think I cheered out loud when I heard that the government had taken the courage to do that. But this potentially puts a massive pressure on the United Kingdom. And it's a pressure that we must be prepared for. The UK has a duty to place each part of this country into a state of preparedness so as that we have sufficient school places, sufficient housing locations, sufficient jobs and opportunities for these people who will have a right to be here and whom we should welcome with open arms, because we should be a place of refuge for the persecuted. And we need to see a plan, and I hope that the Foreign Office and the Home Office will bring that home soon. Finally, Ms. Ghani, I would urge China, I respectfully ask them, and I would urge them, I would implore them to respect that Hong Kong is different to mainland China. I would urge our new consul to make a strong case for the Hong Kongers. I would call for the release of the peaceful protesters who are already in jail and facing persecution. I would call on the government in China to fulfill its Sino-British joint declaration on freedom of the rule of law. And I think I would, as others will, and no doubt in this to be a challenge HSBC, don't do the dirty work of Beijing so as that people are clamped down on for making a living and having their right. So, Madam Chair, I leave those thoughts with you, and I hope that this debate will go some way in expressing the anger and contempt there is for what has happened to these dear people in Hong Kong.
To ensure that we can get all backbenchers in, I will have to impose a time limit to 4.5 minutes. And I go to Andrew Rosingdale.
Good afternoon, Ms. Ghani, and may I say what a pleasure it is to serve under your chair, but also to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Gedling, for securing what I believe is an important and timely debate about Hong Kong, but also to add my voice to support the arguments he has so powerfully made this afternoon. Now, last Friday marked the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, when Chinese Communist Party brutally repressed pro-democracy protests in 1989, killing thousands and causing panic amongst Hong Kongers, many of whom were refugees from Chairman Mao's purges and feared authoritarian communist rule. This was 5 years after Margaret Thatcher had signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration with Deng Xiaoping, agreeing to hand over Hong Kong to China in 1997. But in 1982, Deng told Mrs. Thatcher that he could, and I quote, walk in and take the whole lot this afternoon if he wanted to which she replied that if he did, the eyes of the world would know what China was like. Well, Ms. Ghani, Tiananmen Square massacre showed the world what China was really like and their disregard for the rights of their own citizens. The Sino-British Joint Declaration was supposed to guarantee Hong Kong's freedom, rule of law, and a way of life unchanged for a period of 50 years. It was a legally binding treaty lodged at the United Nations underpinning Hong Kong's mini-constitution and provided the basic law with freedom of expression, a free press and an independent judiciary, and the right of Hong Kongers to participate in free elections. But the national security law introduced by Beijing is nothing less than an all-out assault on the autonomy of Hong Kong and the freedoms, and a complete violation of that treaty. The pace at which we have watched the decline of one of the most open and international cities in Asia is shocking and should alarm each and every one of us. And so, as the co-signatory of the Joint Declaration and the guarantor of Hong Kong's autonomy, I believe that Her Majesty's government must now take more determined action. First, there must be a punitive cost for the Hong Kong and Chinese officials who are guilty of dismantling the city's autonomy and engaged in cracking down on the pro-democracy movement. All individuals involved in the destruction of democracy in Hong Kong should be subject to coordinated Magnitsky sanctions, with the government working in tandem with our allies. Second, we must do more to support those brave young protesters, many of whom face the prospect of arrest under this draconian law, but do not qualify for the government's BNO visa scheme. We should now make an exception for those born after 1997 who cannot come over as dependents. Third, the government must stand up for those pro-democracy activists in jail who have British citizenship. The British government has a duty and responsibility to defend British citizens from Chinese government oppression. And finally, the government should not allow the United Kingdom's chairmanship of this week's G7 summit to go to waste. Hong Kong must be on the agenda, as my right honourable friend for Chingford Woodford Green has already made clear. It is both the right time and the right forum to press for coordinated action from the world's leading democracies. This should include the creation of a UN Special Rapporteur for Hong Kong. The crisis in Hong Kong represents a substantial challenge to the idea of global Britain, Ms. Ghani. The people of Hong Kong look to the United Kingdom as a once proud Crown colony to lead the international response, and I believe Her Majesty's government simply cannot let them down.
We now go to Lewisham East to Janet Davey.
Thank you, Ms. Ghani. I'm grateful to speak today, and it's a pleasure to serve under you as chair. The UK government has abandoned the people of Hong Kong, who once shared much of their national identity with ours. It's shameful. Over just the past year, we've had countless debates on the atrocious actions of the Chinese regime, but their human rights abuses continue, and we cannot condone this. Magnitsky sanctions have rightfully been placed on CCP officials responsible for the horrors of the Uyghur genocide, but no such action for their counterparts in Hong Kong. We must not stand by as Beijing violate the independence of Hong Kong, imposing their oppressive national security law, manipulating the electoral system so pro-democracy politicians cannot stand, expelling judges and ruthlessly arresting and abusing people who wish to challenge this. After years of the Chinese government stripping Hong Kong of its basic access to freedom and democracy, we must show Hong Kongers we will not leave them high and dry. A year ago, Hong Kong Watch launched their International Lifeboat Scheme, calling for the UK to join international partners in providing refuge for those fleeing Hong Kong. Extending the BNO visa to those wishing to leave Hong Kong was most welcome. Recent figures show that this has been taken up by nearly 35,000 people. However, it does not go far enough. We must make provision for young people from Hong Kong born after 1997 who are just as entitled to the UK support and protection as their parents. For the protesters who have bravely risked their safety to challenge Beijing's authoritarian takeover and now face serious criminal charges, we cannot just pull up the drawbridge. And growing up in Hong Kong is not only dangerous for those activists. Children as young as 6 years old, and my child is 6 years old, are being taught their national security doctrine in school. There are restrictions on what students can learn and discuss in universities. They are growing up with more and more limited access to neutral news sources. So I ask the Minister, what will Britain do to fulfil our obligation to these children and young people? And will he join me in saying we must not just stand with Hong Kong, we must stand up for Hong Kong, and that means action. What action will the government be taking?
I'll turn to Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Ms. Ghani. It's a pleasure to serve as your chairmanship, and I thank the Honourable Member for Gedling for securing such an important debate. Today marks 2 years since the pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong attended by hundreds of thousands of people of all ages and backgrounds. This mighty display of people power symbolised an unwavering belief in civic values, hope and optimism for change, and a refusal to be cowed by the Communist Party in Beijing. However, 2 years on, Every single person in the free world has a duty to feel horrified about the events taking place in Hong Kong, a supposed free society. Beijing detests dissent of any description, and the past few years tightened its stranglehold over free Hong Kong. The final straw was the huge anti-extradition bill protests. Almost immediately, Beijing imposed a security law which was straight out of the mainland Chinese playbook. What is most disturbing is that this repression was not discreet and creeping, as one might have expected. Instead, the Chinese are so brazen they have turned Hong Kong into Shanghai overnight, banning visuals, destroying controversial books from libraries, and making mass arrests. This sends a chill through society in Hong Kong. The grotesque policing attempts to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre are a testament to this. If this overnight transformation of society can happen in Hong Kong, it can happen anywhere. There is no doubt in my mind that Britain is solely responsible for Hong Kong's fate. We have a singular and enduring responsibility to the people of Hong Kong as the former ruling power and the guarantor of the freedoms secured in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Regrettably, we have not covered ourselves in glory in this role. There are no other examples of a leading democracy handing over a free society to an authoritarian regime which clearly could not be trusted. We failed again in the 1990s. We made a grave and unforgivable mistake by granting Hong Kongers a bespoke class of British citizenship in the run-up to the handover, abdicating our responsibilities. And now we have not done nearly enough to challenge China and make them pay for their actions. Hundreds of thousands of British nationals have been left their fate, and Asia's brightest light is going out, with many fearing it shall become just another Chinese city. We cannot stand by and watch. This is not only an attack on the people of Hong Kong, but also a direct Chinese insult to the UK as a signatory of the Joint Declaration. In many ways, we have failed Hong Kong, and this failure occurred the moment we trusted China's empty promises. This failure is evidenced by Hong Kong's wholesale rejection of the PRC and everything it stands for, and their continued association with Britain. Hong Kongers, of course, have their own proud sense of identity, but they also look to us as a guarantor of their freedoms and as a beacon of democracy. I welcome that this government has somewhat corrected a previous folly by providing a pathway to full citizenship for British nationals overseas. This is commendable, and I greatly look forward to welcoming Hong Kongers to Britain, where they'll make a hugely positive contribution to our society. However, we could and we still must do so much more on all fronts. So what can be done? Firstly, we must review British involvement and the involvement of British nationals in the Hong Kong police and judiciary, as we must not be complicit in Chinese oppression. Secondly, we must support Hong Kongers who do not qualify for the BNO scheme. One of the few things Portugal did right in Macau was to guarantee full Portuguese citizenship to all Macanese. We have implemented this for our overseas territories, so we must look again at this for Hong Kong. Thirdly, we must marshal a strong and coordinated international response against China in order to make the Chinese think again. They must realise that this conduct is not acceptable anywhere, be that in the South China Sea, Tibet, Xinjiang, the Indian borders, or Taiwan. Next, and most importantly, we must never trust China again. The one country, two systems model has been proven to be a lie, and we must be swayed by short-term financial dividends when dealing with China, as we know that this way we shall pay dearly in the long term. Lastly, young Hong Kongers are the future of the city. We must do everything in our power to support them in their resistance, both here and in Hong Kong. And I'm certain that if we put these policies into action, freedom will once again bring from Gloucester Road to Victoria Peak, from Stanley to Aberdeen, from the Admiralty to Lamma Island, and from Calwood to Queensway.
I now turn to Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gani, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I also congratulate the Honourable Member from Gedling for securing this debate. One of the things he said in his introduction, and he was quite right, was that this should not be about the history of our relationship with Hong Kong, and it's certainly not about recreating some sort of imperial past. But I think our own recent history in regard to the territory is important, and it is worth reflecting on. Because in fact, the position in which we find ourselves today isn't something that has happened overnight. It is the result, the product of 3 decades, possibly more, of British foreign policy. A determination to put commercial interests over human rights. Yeah, I chair the all-party parliamentary group, co-chair it with Baroness Bennett from the other place, and I'm also a patron of Hong Kong Watch. So we've seen the repeated pattern of people telling us that when we spoke about human rights, maybe just wind your neck in. There's another deal coming, there's a delegation going, there's going to be a visit, there's going to be a conference, or whatever it was. And essentially, for the years since we completed, as we entered into the joint declaration, we've sent all the wrong signals. And that's now what has brought us to the place where we are today. I'm delighted, genuinely delighted, that the government has taken the action that they have with regard to BNO passport holders. But how much better, how much stronger might our position be if we had done that at the point of handover in 1997? Because that was surely the point at which we could have sent a signal to say that we intended to stand with the people of Hong Kong, and our failure at that time was seen by the Chinese government as an intention that perhaps we didn't mean the things that we said in the joint declaration. And it is ironic when you consider, in fact, that we entered into the joint declaration because of our experience in relation to the Falkland Islands. Another instance where we had sent the wrong signals to a despotic regime who then thought that they could take advantage of it. We tried to avoid that by entering into the joint declaration, but we don't seem to have learned the lessons of it. There are a couple of issues in relation to which I just want to touch very briefly in the time available to me. The first of these is in relation to the position of the BBC in Hong Kong and in China. It seems to me that the relationship that they have with RTHK as their local partner, as it were, becomes increasingly problematic. On the 1st of March this year, the new head of RTHK, career civil servant Patrick Lee, took charge. He pledged editorial independence, but said that there cannot, and I quote, there cannot be freedom without restraint. George Orwell himself would have been proud of that one. But it does seem to me that now, with the World News TV channel being taken off the air in China, with the blocking of news channels and internet provision for years, that really we have to look at what more we can do to support the World Service, which is the blue chip standard still in broadcasting around the world. And secondly, I really would like to hear a bit more from the government about what we are saying to those, especially financial institutions like HSBC and Standard Chartered, who have both come out in support of the national security law, that we allow them to continue to operate as normal in this country seems to run contradictory to what we say about our intentions now with regard to Hong Kong. It has been it's been reported, in fact, that there have been no fewer than 16 private meetings between Treasury and these two banks in relation in the 6-month period from July 2020 to December 2020. What was said at them, and why are we still engaging on a business as usual basis?
I now go to Florence Eshalami.
Thank you, Ms. Garner. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I would also like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Gelling for securing his first Westminster Hall debate on such an important issue. I've just come from visiting a school in my constituency, just over the river, Oasis South Academy on Westminster Bridge Road, and speaking to the students ranging from year 7 right through to year 13. They spoke to me about the issues happening right across the world and why it's so important for us in the UK to be calling out the human rights abuse we see across the world. We can't say as a country we stand and support democracy if we don't call out those injustices happening right across the world. And many of my constituents have written to me about this issue as they are concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong. And there can be no doubt that what is occurring is a severe breach of human rights abuse. In 2017, activists Alex Chow, Nathan Law and Joshua Wong were given draconian prison sentences for taking part in democracy protests. A protest movement that has been driven by disenfranchised young people who just want representation, the same like our young people in this country. Then this year, a month ago, a year today, the Chinese government introduced the national security law in Hong Kong, which gives Beijing the power to interpret laws in Hong Kong independently of any judicial or local policy body. Since then, this law has been used to crack down on pro-democracy activists and politicians. This is not right and cannot be happening in 2021. This January, 55 leading pro-democracy figures were arrested for simply exercising their legitimate democratic rights. And on the 30th of March, the election laws were changed to vet those running the elections according to their patriotism. Taken together, these incidents suggest a really worrying trend of the rapid and dangerous erosion of human rights for Hong Kong nationals. And there's no sign of stopping, which means that the current sanctions are inefficient to deter China from their chosen path of action. As a signatory to the joint declaration, the UK is in a unique position to guarantee a high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong until at least 2047. As a country, we must therefore redouble our efforts to protect the people and the sovereignty of Hong Kong. So I asked the Minister in his response, will he outline what further steps the government is taking to protect the basic human rights we are all guaranteed and impose the sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for the crackdown on pro-democracy campaigns? Thank you, Chair.
We now go to Mr. John McDonnell.
Thank you. It's always difficult and frustrating to identify what effective role we can play as MPs when there's abuse of human rights across the world. And my view is that at least we can bear witness to what's happening, and also then draw out, mobilize for action as well, whether it's in Gaza or Yemen or Hong Kong. At least we can call it out. So what I would like to do just in the few minutes I've got is just bear witness to what's happening to a number of my trade union colleagues and, well, friends as they've become over campaigns over the years. They're part of the Hong Kong 47 trial. Lee Chuk-yang is the General Secretary of the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, who I've worked with. Carol Ng, until her imprisonment in February, she was the chair of the Trade Union Confederation. In fact, I worked with Carol in the British Airways dispute, where she was a Unite rep. And Winnie Yu, chair of the Health Workers Union, that was one of the new unions that was formed in late 2019. They had a 5-day strike in January in 2019. It was against the Hong Kong administration's early COVID complacency. All of them now are up before the courts. They're imprisoned. And what worries me is at the hearing on Monday, May the 31st, the Department of Justice declared that it wished to move the trial from the District Court to the High Court. So the implication of that is that the sentences on the Hong Kong 47, of which my friends are included, will exceed the limit of 7 years, which the District Council are limited to. And the maximum sentences now could be up to life imprisonment. My friend's defence attorneys at Monday's hearing asked for clarification that the trial would be conducted in open court with a jury, and the prosecutors refused to give that assurance. So there's a real possibility that the judges can convict without press or public scrutiny. And the next hearing is on July the 8th, which will decide whether it will be public or whether there will be a jury. And it's critical that we maximise all the pressure we possibly can through our own government and also civil society here and internationally to seek at least the openness of that trial itself. Lee Chuk-yang is bravely agitating from jail still. His sentences for illegal unauthorised assembly are piling up. So far, he's accumulated 20 months, but there's more trials to follow. And like all trade unionists engaged in international dialogue, the regime may at some stage deem his work there, in quotes, coalition with foreign powers and in breach of the national security law. That's my fear. Another prominent target of the regime is Lung Kwok Hung, who's known widely as Long Hair. He's an avowed left-wing socialist in the League of Social Democrats, and he's so far accumulated at least 24 months. And it just goes on. I've listened to the other speeches, and I support the call for Magnitsky sanctions, of course I do, and of course I support the calls for ensuring that actually the younger BNO passport holders and can be actually accommodated, those ones who were born after 97. But I have to say also, I agree with those who've pointed out the role of British companies that are playing, and we have to address this matter because they lobbied the Prime Minister to try and get him to tone down the government's criticisms. Swire, the company that owns Cathay Pacific, they led the way in sacking staff who support the democracy movement. Yes, HSBC and Chartered Bank, Standard Chartered, of course, but what about Jardine Matheson? Because they supported the national security law. And actually, I have to say to colleagues in other parties, they were also Tory donors. We need to call out these British corporations, UK corporations, who are the sponsors of the repression in Hong Kong by the Chinese regime. We have a duty to do that as well.
I now turn to Wera Hobhouse, forgive me.
Thank you, Ms. Ghani. The Chinese Communist Party has continued to dismantle Hong Kong's autonomy at a worrying pace. This month marks the 32nd anniversary of Tiananmen Square and the second year that the Hong Kong authorities banned a vigil in memory of the atrocity. It would have been a meaningful show of solidarity had the British consulate in Hong Kong put candles in its windows to commemorate this anniversary, as did the US and EU consulates. And it's disappointing that it didn't happen. We must, of course, condemn the arrest of Chow Hang-tung and continue to do all in our power to support those fighting for democracy. Western democracies need to be showing a united front against the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to silence historical truth. British foreign policy must be even more vocally standing up for human rights. I urge the Minister to push for the creation of a UN Special Rapporteur for Hong Kong to monitor the human rights situation in the city, and we have heard this already today. But perhaps the biggest thing that we in the UK can do to help Hong Kongers is by making it easier for those with BNO status to make their lives here. The number of people who have applied within the first 10 weeks of the citizenship scheme opening up is about 35,000, more than a tenth of the 300,000 people that the government expected to apply. The offer of the government to open its doors to Hong Kong is welcome and supported by all parties, but allowing them to come here is one thing, giving them the opportunity to make a good life here is another. What steps are the government taking to support those people from Hong Kong who want to make their lives in the UK? A survey conducted by Hong Kongers in Britain showed that only half of those who responded have friends in the UK, even fewer have got family here. It's not easy, even in the best of circumstances, to move to a new country, thousands of miles away from where you come from, possibly where you don't know anyone, find a job and settle into the community. Imagine how difficult that would be in the middle of a pandemic. Imagine if initially your English language skills are not so good. From finding employment to using public services to placing their children in schools, many BNOs will need additional assistance to make their lives here in Britain. Many BNOs in Hong Kong remain fearful that they will not be able to find employment when they reach the UK. The 43 million integration fund to help BNUs and their family settle here is extremely welcome, but there are reports that the UK government has hugely underestimated the take-up of the offer. There are concerns that this money will not be enough to meet the scale of the challenge. So what additional support will the government, and additionally, what support will the government offer to those born after 1997, many of whom have been at the forefront of fighting for democracy in Hong Kong? And can the Minister offer his assurances to those Hong Kongers born after 1997 who claim asylum in the UK that they will not have their applications rejected and face deportation? Today, Ms. Ghani, today's debate is a stark reminder that human rights are under threat in many parts of the world, and increasingly so in China. The plight of Hong Kongers whose history is so closely linked to Britain needs our urgent attention, and we need to do even more than we have done so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jim Shannon.
Thank
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate. And I know that if you were to not chair, Madam Chair, you would be here on the floor making the viewpoints the same. So I want to just say, I'm sure you feel that you wish to be here, but it's good to have you here in spirit. Can I also congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Gedling for setting the tone for the debate. Chinese authorities have committed many human rights abuses in Hong Kong. However, Hong Kong is not an isolated case. And these human rights violations are situated in the context of some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, whether it be the forced organ harvesting of practitioners of Falun Gong to the mass incarceration of Uyghur Muslims. The Chinese Communist Party has inflicted untold suffering on its citizens. I believe that these current concerns must be considered together, as how a state treats its minorities is a reflection, I believe, of its attitude towards democracy and human rights in general. Indeed, thinking of Myanmar, where the military's genocidal treatment of Rohingya Muslims, minority communities have suffered human rights abuses in China. I mean, you see all the things that are happening and you do despair. At this point, I'd like to register, if I can, an interest as chair of the APPG for International Freedom of Religion and Belief, and quote a couple of other ones, which, again, Chinese Communist Party has influence, and Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy have referred to the severely deteriorating human rights situation in Tibet has reached the level of crimes against humanity. This concern is a result of the CCP's force and simulation policies. And there are also concerns up to 500,000 Tibetans are involved in forced labour in China. These reports, deeply distressing though they are, should not be a surprise to anyone who's been following the plight of the Uyghurs, who've been rounded up in the largest arbitrary detention of a religious group since the Holocaust. Nor should it be a surprise to anyone familiar with the China Tribunal's judgment that China's campaign of forced organ harvesting against innocent victims is a crime against humanity. The Falun Gong have been central to that, constituting, I believe, one of the world's worst atrocities committed. Hong Kong authorities have used the same rhetoric, increasingly adopting mainland China's vague definition of national security to restrict the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly, expression and association. So I welcome the government and the minister's commitment to sanctions against a number of human rights violators in China, but note that there are many other key figures such as Carrie Lam in Hong Kong, Chen Quango in Xinjiang province, who have thus far avoided sanction by the UK. So I would ask the Minister to give us some assurance today that those two, I use this word retrobate, I think I use that word because I don't think it's a bad word. I know it tells a story, the word itself tells a story. Those two retrobates should be made accountable for their activities. The Minister, I believe, must take the opportunity presented by the upcoming meeting of the G7 to collaborate with international counterparts to take decisive action. Can I suggest it would be to publicly call for the 2022 Winter Olympics to be moved from Beijing? I believe it's unthinkable that a state which is actively engaged in crimes against humanity should be allowed to host such a major international event. It would send an extremely powerful message, demanding the Winter Olympics be removed. I would also call on the Minister for the establishment of a commission of inquiry on human rights abuses in China. I welcome the government's call for Beijing to allow the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights full access to Xinjiang, but China has thus far refused this call and is unlikely to change its position. So I believe then, as stated by Human Rights Watch, UN inquiries into abuses have shown that investigations can be comprehensive and credible, even with the Chinese government's cooperation. Without the China government's cooperation, there is ample evidence of the impact on human rights in Hong Kong and elsewhere due to the Chinese government's policies. A commission of inquiry can be established outside of the UN Security Council and therefore can avoid China's veto. Let's do the things that we can do and bite these people where it hurts. Introduce the sanctions against all violators of human rights in Hong Kong and China. 1. 2. Publicly call for the 2022 Winter Olympics to be moved from Beijing. And 3. Push for a UN Commission of Inquiry into human rights abuses in China. Those 3 things, I believe, are things that this government and my government and my minister can do. I wish them to do those things because we here have a responsibility to speak for those voiceless people who have nobody to speak for them. And we're all here united. We want action and we want our government to do it.
And I go to the SNP spokesperson, Alan Smith.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd also warmly congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Gedling for an excellent speech, and I'm very happy to agree with the tone and the content of it. There's been a number of very constructive, strong contributions from across the House today. Because the reality is, Ms Ghani, that we are bound to the people of Hong Kong in a way that we are not bound to a number of other people in other places. We owe them a debt of empire. It is a special case. We also owe a legal debt in that the UK is a part guarantor of the Sino-British Agreement guaranteeing one country, two systems. Hong Kong's autonomy is guaranteed in part, partially, by the UK. And yet, the national security law was passed. Since its passing, over 100 pro-democracy activists, and there's been plenty more before that, have been arrested under it. They're facing 10 years in jail on trumped-up charges. Joshua Wong's been sentenced to 10 months in prison for attending a peaceful vigil. Tong Yin Kit, on the 20th of May, a particularly worrying development, was informed not entitled to jury trial on trumped-up terrorism charges. I think that's significant for everyone under detention. In academic freedom, the University of Hong Kong and the Chinese University of Hong Kong have shut down their student unions and massively curtailed freedom of speech on campus, in stark opposition to the activities of Confucius Institutes within our boundaries. And it goes on. And as we've heard from many people in the contribution, honourable and right honourable members today in the contributions, the situation is deteriorating in a daily basis in every way. Now, the UK has not been idle. It would be churlish of me to not recognise the fact that the UK diplomats have been active on this. I particularly applaud and recognise the significance of the BNO scheme for the Hong Kongers themselves. That is a major, significant commitment. But I honestly struggle to think of anything that Beijing has refrained from or reversed because of UK government pressure, be it in Hong Kong or indeed anywhere else. The reality is that one country, two systems is dead, and it died under the watch of this government. In the face of Beijing's wolf warriors, the UK's tiger has, I'm afraid, been somewhat toothless. Some concrete suggestions, because we've heard a number of suggestions today, and I'll make some also. I'd echo the call for more Magnitsky sanctions on individuals. Now, we've had this discussion before with our Minister. We're not looking for speculation, we are looking for announcements. I appreciate there won't be speculation, but we do want to see progress on this across the House. The financial assets and business dealings of a number of UK companies do need more scrutiny, particularly the actions of the banks, particularly in that case Standard Chartered and HSBC, who have on occasion acted on behalf of authorities under very, very dubious legality. Speaking of dubious legality, UK judges should absolutely withdraw from the Hong Kong judicial system. They are lending a veneer of credibility and respectability to a system that simply doesn't merit it. And the Confucius Institutes, as I and others have mentioned, active within the countries of the UK, must have far greater scrutiny on their actions than they have had to date. I echo calls also for a UN Special Rapporteur into Hong Kong that would assist in broadening the coalition, which already exists in part, but giving it a greater focus on the scrutiny of events within Hong Kong. And I'd also echo calls that the G7 is an opportunity to see some progress on that, as well as a wider international alignment, particularly with our friends in the EU, the US and Canada, on sanctions and transparency on Hong Kong and the actions of Beijing within it. So to conclude, Ms. Ghani, I think there's been a lot of good agreement across the House today. I think there's been a number of good suggestions. And if our Minister shows us some concrete action on those, he will continue to have SNP support in the endeavours of the rights of the peoples of Hong Kong, because they are a special case. We are bound to them, and it's right we keep them on our agenda. Thank you.
I now go to the opposition spokesperson, Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ghani, and it's a real pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'd also like to congratulate the Honourable Member, the gentleman, for Gedling, for securing this extremely important debate. And I'd certainly like to pay tribute to all of the contributions that we've heard today. It really is quite striking to see how united we are across the House in our condemnation of the behaviour and activities of Beijing. And I do hope that the Minister will note the united nature of the message that he's hearing today. I'd also like to, of course, pay particular tribute to my honourable friends, the members for Lewisham East and for Vauxhall and for Hayes and Harlington, for the powerful and passionate contributions that they made to the debate today. The Chinese government's assault on Hong Kong's democratic institutions and its ongoing persecution of pro-democracy activists is a scar on the conscience of the world, but it is of particular importance to our country. Beijing's actions represent a flagrant violation of international law via the multiple breaches of the Sino-British Declaration, including the introduction and application of the national security law, contempt for the Hong Kong Basic Law, riding roughshod over the one country, two systems framework, and a relentless crackdown on established universal rights and freedoms such as the right to free speech, media freedom, judicial independence, and the right to peaceful protest. We've seen opposition lawmakers forced out of office, then a new law imposed to prevent critics of Beijing standing for office. We've seen the trade union activist Li Chuqian sentenced to 18 months in prison simply for attending democratic protests, and others like him targeted. We've seen the media owner, Jimmy Lai, jailed for more than a year on spurious charges, while Radio Television Hong Kong's independence has been compromised. BBC World Radio has been taken off air following the ban of BBC World News in China, which itself came as a result of the BBC's outstanding and important investigative journalism into the persecution of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. And we've seen, perhaps most tragically of all in terms of Hong Kong, the arrests and sentencing of scores of liberal pro-democracy activists, including brave young leaders such as Joshua Wong, Ivan Lam, and Agnes Chow, and the Hong Kong 8. Trials are increasingly taking place in secret, without a jury, utterly undermining the basic foundations of judicial independence upon which Hong Kong's rule of law is built. In short, the Chinese government is doing all it can to crush the democratic rights of the Hong Kong people and to assert its own authoritarian, despotic system. Let me be clear, Ms. Ghani, that the Labour Party will stand up for democracy, human rights and the rule of law everywhere, and will call out violations wherever they take place. We apply these principles without fear or favour, and we will always encourage the government to work in partnership with our international allies to defend the values that we cherish. It is therefore a matter of real regret that the UK government has at times left us in a position of weakness. Consecutive Conservative governments since 2010 have been naive and complacent in their dealings with the Chinese Communist Party leadership. These successive Conservative governments have eroded the UK's leverage and influence, firstly by leaving the British economy over-reliant on Chinese imports and supply chains. Shockingly, 57 of our critical national infrastructure supply chains are now reliant on China. Secondly, by failing to maintain and form the alliances on the world stage to defend our values and interests. In 2015, David Cameron and George Osborne, with enthusiastic support from the then London Mayor Boris Johnson, proclaimed a golden era of UK-China relations, a strategy designed to open up UK markets to Chinese business and investment in the expectation that China would fall in line with international norms around trade and human rights. Well, the opposite has happened. Uncompetitive market behaviour by state-backed Chinese firms has contributed to the £19 billion deficit that we're still running with China. And in short, the Chinese government has failed to align with any of the values or norms that the golden era was based on. We've seen the compromising of national and economic security by increased reliance on China, and we've also seen a concerning tendency to have a lack of consistency across government, and of course we saw the divisions around the genocide amendment to the trade bill, which the UK government chose to block, which was a matter of profound regret to the Labour Party. We therefore need a long-term strategy. The Prime Minister has a unique opportunity to deliver this at the G7. It means rebuilding our strategic independence by reducing our exposure to Chinese investment and supply chains. It means addressing the national security issues, particularly around Taiwan. And it really does mean looking at areas where China holds a de facto global monopoly, particularly around rare earth metals, for example. Looking to the shorter term, we must do more to support the people of Hong Kong. We need more support from the government in terms of British nationals overseas, language support, access to GPs, access to housing. We must see a clear route to citizenship for Hong Kongers born after 1997. And we must not give up on those who are still campaigning. We need the Magnitsky sanctions that have been mentioned by many honourable members. We need a judge-led inquiry into police brutality, and we need, as the Labour Party is calling for, British judges to leave Hong Kong. British judges are simply lending a veneer of credibility to the undemocratic, broken system that exists there. Has the UK government made an assessment of whether UK judges are protecting the rule of law in Hong Kong or simply legitimising an authoritarian regime? Will the UK government join the opposition in taking this clear and principled position? We also need to see action on banks such as HSBC, who, as honourable members have said, appear to be doing the dirty work of the Chinese government. I believe that there are so many important actions that this government can and should take. We should bear in mind that the democracy is in retreat across the world. A recent report showed that authoritarian regimes, for the first time since 2001, outnumber democracies. That is something we should take very careful note of. Hong Kong needs the free world, and the free world needs Hong Kong. So I look forward to hearing the Minister's response to these questions and important issues. Thank you.
I now turn to the Minister, Minister Nigel Adams.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Garney. And can I just say how grateful I am to my honourable friend, the member for Gedling, for securing this debate, and to honourable and right honourable members for their contributions, very passionate and well-informed contributions on a subject that we've had the opportunity to debate several times, and I'm sure this won't be the last time that the issue of Hong Kong is brought to this House. But I want to pay my tribute to his work on the Public Administration Constitutional Affairs Committee also. I will try and respond to as many of the points raised as possible during my remarks, but also, as I've said previously during debates on this issue, and I think I've written to the honourable member for Orkney and Shetland and other members of the all-party group, that my door and the offices of my officials at the CDO is always open. We're very keen to discuss on a one-to-one basis with you the issues, the important issues that you raise, and we have a depth of experience and knowledge in King Charles Street that we're more than happy to share. So hopefully we'll be able to follow up on that. And as rightly been said, this has been and it continues to be the most concerning period in Hong Kong's post-handover history. And I acknowledge, and as Minister for Asia, I deeply regret not having had the opportunity to visit Hong Kong under better circumstances. I know some of my predecessors have been able to do so, and in saying that, I share the deep concern of this House. But that is why we have taken clear and decisive action, that we've extended the existing arms embargo on mainland China to include Hong Kong. Honourable and right honourable members will know that we've suspended the extradition treaty with Hong Kong, and we're creating this new visa route for British nationals overseas, which I'll come on to shortly. Colleagues will know that the Sino-British Joint Declaration was registered with the United Nations on the 12th of June 1985. They will also know that this declaration is a legally binding international treaty that remains in force today. And this agreement between the United Kingdom and China made clear that Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, rights and freedoms would remain unchanged for 50 years from 1997, as pointed out by the Honourable Member for Vauxhall. In this agreement, China undertook to uphold freedoms of speech, of the press and of assembly. And they also agreed, Ms Garney, to keep in force the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and to maintain the independent judiciary and rule of law. For more than 2 decades after the handover, these rights and freedoms underpinned Hong Kong's prosperity and way of life. Now, honourable and right honourable members will also be aware that in 2019 and the early part of 2020, Hong Kong experienced a period of deep turmoil with widespread unrest triggered by proposals which would have allowed extradition to mainland China. And we were clear from the outset that the solution to this unrest must come from within Hong Kong and must not be imposed from mainland China. Instead, Ms. Ghani, the Chinese authorities have shown an increasing propensity to breach their obligations in relation to Hong Kong. And I think on this, today, we're all agreed. Since last June, Beijing's actions have led us to declare 3 breaches of the joint declaration, including significant erosions of Hong Kong's autonomy and the rights and freedoms of its people. The national security law imposed on Hong Kong by Beijing last June contains a slew of measures that directly undermine those rights and freedoms. China's own basic law for Hong Kong makes clear that the territory should put forward and enact its own security legislation. So the direct imposition of the national security law is in clear contravention of this. Senior Chinese government figures, Ms. Ghani, claimed at the time that the law would target a tiny number of criminals who seriously endanger national security. But everybody in this room and watching this debate realises that this law has been used systematically to restrict freedom of expression and has been brought up today by just about every member in this chamber. We see in the courts with the ongoing trials of 47 pro-democracy politicians and activists for their alleged roles in unofficial political primaries last year. These cases and others demonstrate in the starkest way that the national security law is being used to stifle political dissent.
I thank the Minister for giving way, as he's on the section of his speech clearly relating to legal and judicial matters. Does he agree with me and I think many others members here today who have said that the continuing presence of British judges in the Hong Kong judicial system is simply lending a veneer of credibility to what is a completely broken system? And will he today give us the guarantee that the British government will be taking whatever means necessary to bring this practice to an end?
Well, the honourable member for Aberabon did raise this in his remarks, and he's right to do so, as did many other honourable and right honourable members. The issue of British judges, they play an important role, Ms. Ghani, in supporting the independence of Hong Kong's judiciary for many years, and we really do hope that this can continue. However, the national security law poses real questions for the rule of law in Hong Kong, and basically the fundamental protection of fundamental rights and freedoms which were promised by China in the joint declaration. It's therefore right that the Supreme Court continues to assess the situation in Hong Kong, and that will be done so in discussion with the government. Ms. Ghani, I'm conscious that I do have to give the honourable member for Gedling a few minutes at the end, so I'll try and get through the points and the rest of my remarks to allow him to do so. So it's clear that the authorities are pursuing politically motivated prosecutions under other laws and against a range of pro-democracy figures, and we've heard today about the cases of Joshua Wong, Jimmy Lai. On the 11th of November, China's National People's Congress Standing Committee imposed new rules to disqualify elected legislators in Hong Kong. And these rules contain vague criteria allowing a wide interpretation. On the 30th of March, we declared this another breach of the joint declaration, undermining both Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and the right to freedom of speech guaranteed under paragraph 3 and Annex 1 of the declaration. Then on the 11th of March this year, the National People's Congress unilaterally decided to change Hong Kong's electoral system without prior consent from Hong Kong's Legislative Council. So the changes give, as we've heard today, Chinese authorities greater control over who stands for elected office and the removal of elected politicians who the authorities deem unpatriotic. It also reverses China's promise to Hong Kong and its own basic law of gradual progress towards universal suffrage, and it hollows out the Legislative Council even further. And as several honourable and right honourable members have pointed out, including the honourable member for Aberavon, these developments amount to a systematic and a determined effort by Beijing to bring Hong Kong under its control. They erase the space for alternative political views and legitimate political debate. I will, and I'll have to be yes, I will. I'll give way to left turn.
What we're really asking for, Minister, with respect, is action from our Minister and our government. So would it be possible to have a public call for the 2022 Winter Olympics to be removed from Beijing, for the independent UN Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights Abuses in China, which can be held without China's veto, and more sanctions against those violators? This is some action, please.
I will come on. My honourable friend for Strangford always makes decisive points. I'll come on to the other two points later on in my remarks. With regards to the Olympics, this is a matter for the British Olympic Association. It is not a matter for governments to intervene. I do need to crack on if my right honourable. If it's on the Olympics, then we'll. Oh right, okay. Well,
you can answer that.
No decision yet has been made about diplomatic attendance at the Olympics, but I can tell you, as the minister responsible, it is very much at the forefront of our minds. So we responded quickly and decisively to the enactment of the national security law. The day after the law was imposed, the Foreign Secretary announced to Parliament that after discussions with his right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, that the government would introduce this bespoke immigration route for British national overseas and their dependents, which would provide a new path to citizenship. This opened on the 31st of January, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of Housing, Communities and Local Government, has implemented a welcome and a settlement package for those who wish to take up the offer. Prior to that, on the 20th of July, the Foreign Secretary announced the indefinite suspension of our extradition treaty with Hong Kong and the extension of our arms embargo on mainland China to Hong Kong. This extradition treaty will remain suspended until we have safeguards to ensure it will not be misused under the national security law. We've also led action in the international community, holding China to account through our presidency of the G7, and I would be very surprised, Ms Garney, if this issue is not discussed either on the agenda or in the corridors of the G7 taking place this week. On the 6th of October, with Germany, we brought together 39 countries to express our grave concern for Hong Kong and Xinjiang in this joint statement at the UN General Assembly Third Committee. The Foreign Secretary, in his high-level statement to the Human Rights Council on the 22nd of February, called for the UN to respond, and he undertook to continue to raising international support. And more recently, on the 5th of May, he called on China to act in accordance with its international commitments and legal obligations, and to respect Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, rights and freedoms. And I acknowledge that many members of the House, including my honourable friend, the member for Romford, right honourable friend for Chingford, the honourable member for Vauxhall, Strangford, have called for sanctions in respect to the events in Hong Kong. As honourable and right honourable members will know, with the experience of our sanctions regime in Xinjiang. We don't speculate on listings, as to do so would impact, could potentially undermine their impact. In the time I've left, I'd just like to address some of the points that members have raised. The issue of those young people born since 1997 without family ties, the BNO status, who are not eligible. These individuals can still apply using our existing routes to live, work or study in the UK. In particular, Hong Kong nationals aged between 18 and 30 are eligible to apply to our youth mobility scheme. My honourable friend, the member for Gedling, raised the prospect of Germany not recognising BNO passports, as did my right honourable friend for Chingford. We have raised our concerns with the German government. They've assured us that all UK passports, including BNO passports, are recognised for the purposes of entry and stay in Germany. So I've probably got a minute left. There's a number of issues that I have to respond to honourable and right honourable members, but please take up my offer of coming to see me and officials in the FCDO, and I can address them, or indeed write to you following this debate. But Ms Ghani, while the turmoil on the streets of Hong Kong may have lessened since 2019, the underlying situation has certainly deteriorated further. After 3 breaches of the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 9 months, the United Kingdom has since March considered Beijing to be in a state of ongoing non-compliance with it. There's a stark and growing gulf between Beijing's promises and its actions. We must and we will continue to stand up for the rights and freedoms of the people of Hong Kong. I give my assurance as Minister for Asia that we will continue to work hard and in good faith towards that goal. We will hold China to the obligation it willingly undertook to safeguard the people of Hong Kong and their way of life.
Thank you, Mr. Tom Randall. Would you like to wind up in a few minutes?
Thank you, Ms Ghani, and I'm grateful for all the honourable and right honourable members who have spoken this afternoon. When I was preparing for this debate, I reread the Hansard debate for the debate on the Joint Declaration back in December 1984, and I was struck by that debate how there was there were some concerns about immigration status, but there was a unanimity across the House that at the time that was the best deal that could have been obtained for Hong Kong. And as the honourable members for Stirling and Aberavon identified today, there has been a similar unanimity across the chamber today on this issue. There have been, as the honourable member for Strangford observed, many other human rights abuses committed by China in the region, but as the right honourable member for Chingford and Woodford Green said, this is the issue of the moment. As the honourable member for Romford said, we are discussing today the decline of the most international of Asian cities. I think what the speeches that we've heard today have illustrated is the breadth of China's actions in Hong Kong, as the honourable member for Rother Valley identifies as brazen actions. We've heard about the manipulation of election rules by the honourable members for Lewisham East and Vauxhall. The honourable member for Hayes and Hollington has spoken passionately about his comrades in the trade union movement who have been affected, and the honourable member for North Antrim has spoken about how even basic things like professing one's faith has been hindered by the actions taken by the Chinese government. The honourable members for Orkney and Shetland and Ochil and South Perthshire spoke on the issue of media clampdowns, and I think one of the most interesting and distressing meetings that I attended while I've been involved in this subject is listening to Hong Kong journalists who had to be identified as witnesses 1, 2 and 3 because of fear of persecution, and I think that they well underline the issues that they face. And as the honourable member for Bath observed, democracies have to put on a united front, and I'm grateful for the Minister for his statement and for what he says, and I think we'll be encouraged if this matter is raised at the G7 this week. It is a matter that does need to be raised, and I'm grateful for the clarification. I think if I conclude in the few moments I have with the 6 monthly report that is produced by the Foreign Office on Hong Kong, which the latest one said it is not too late for the authorities to reach out and start to heal divisions, however complicated and difficult that might be.
So I think we can just quickly, instead of extending this, to say the question is that this House has considered human rights in Hong Kong. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until